Senator J.D. Vance's pointed warning to Moscow to wake up and accept reality regarding the Ukraine war represents a significant strain of thought emerging within American conservative foreign policy circles. This statement is less a message of surrender and more a declaration of strategic realism. The belief that the current military situation is a stalemate and that the goal of a total, decisive Ukrainian victory to reclaim all occupied territory is increasingly unattainable through current means. The analysis centers on the concept of aid fatigue and resource limitation. Vance's position, shared by other realist voices, suggests that continuing to fund a protracted, high-attrition war without a clear, achievable end goal is detrimental to U.S. national interests. By telling Moscow to accept reality, Vance is implicitly arguing that the West must also accept the reality of the front lines, frozen conflict, and shift focus from supporting an offensive liberation to pushing for a negotiated settlement that reflects the geopolitical facts on the ground. This perspective is a direct challenge to the bipartisan establishment consensus in Washington, which maintains that continued military support is the only way to ensure Ukraine's sovereignty and deter future Russian aggression. Reasons and underlying context. Several factors motivate this push for a new strategic assessment from influential figures like Vance. 1. The military stalemate. The primary catalyst is the persistent deadlock on the front lines. Despite significant Western military aid, Ukraine's counteroffensives have yielded limited territorial gains, confirming that Russian defenses are entrenched. This stagnation forces a difficult cost-benefit analysis. Are the tens of billions of dollars in aid justifying the negligible changes in territorial control? For realists, the answer is no, arguing that the war has reached its military exhaustion point. 2. Competing national priorities. The realist argument asserts that Washington's focus should pivot to pressing domestic issues or higher priority foreign policy challenges, particularly China. Proponents of this view argue that the immense resources poured into Ukraine distract from necessary investments in domestic infrastructure, border security, and preparing for a potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific. The Ukraine war, from this standpoint, has become a distraction from greater geopolitical threats. 3. Domestic political pressure. Within the Republican Party, there is a powerful and growing isolationist wing skeptical of foreign entanglements and massive foreign aid expenditures. Vance's public statements reflect and amplify this base-level political pressure, demanding more accountability and a defined strategy for aid packages rather than blank checks. This position resonates with voters facing high inflation and domestic economic uncertainty. Consequences. The consequences of this accept reality discourse are immediate and profound, affecting multiple geopolitical axes. 1. Division within the Western alliance. The most significant consequence is the fracturing of the unified Western Front. When a prominent U.S. senator publicly suggests that Moscow should accept the current reality, it sends mixed signals to European allies, some of whom are more geographically exposed and ideologically committed to Ukraine's full victory. This rhetoric creates uncertainty in Kyiv and provides psychological comfort to the Kremlin, suggesting a crack in the armor of Western resolve. 2. Undermining Kyiv's negotiating position. Such calls for realism, if adopted as official policy, would effectively legitimize any territorial gains Russia currently holds. This drastically weakens Ukraine's position at any future negotiating table, forcing them to concede land that was seized illegally. For Kyiv, this is seen as rewarding aggression and setting a dangerous precedent for international norms. Number 3, the risk of future aggression. Critics argue that the consequence of pressuring Ukraine to negotiate now is signaling to Russia and other authoritarian regimes that invading a sovereign neighbor is an acceptable pathway to acquiring territory, provided the invading power can withstand sanctions and military counteraction long enough to establish a permanent stalemate. Prediction and solutions. Prediction. The war is highly likely to transition from an active war of maneuver to a frozen conflict state, resembling the situation in Cyprus or the Korean Peninsula. U.S. military aid will likely become conditional and finite, shifting from providing weapons for large-scale offensive operations to supplying defensive systems aimed solely at holding the current line. The political will in Washington to continually fund expansive counteroffensives will erode further, especially with looming domestic political cycles. Solutions to manage this reality must be multifaceted. Conditional diplomatic leverage. U.S. and NATO support should be leveraged to force an immediate, verifiable ceasefire. Aid should become conditional, tied not just to fighting, but to participation in good faith negotiations centered on demilitarizing the current front lines and establishing an internationally monitored non-contact zone. Shift to defensive fortification. Instead of pouring resources into offensive weapons, the West should focus on rapidly fortifying Ukraine's current defensive positions and bolstering the security guarantees of the eastern NATO flank, Poland, Romania, Baltics. This provides stability and deterrence without requiring continuous offensive operations. Prioritizing economic reconstruction. A significant portion of future Western funding should be redirected from military equipment toward economic support and infrastructure reconstruction in non-occupied Ukrainian territories. The long-term stability of Ukraine is dependent not only on its borders, but on the health and vitality of its economy and governance. Vance's realism ultimately demands that policy goals align with attainable outcomes, even if those outcomes are politically and morally unsatisfying.